Dames en heren, welkom. Ik mag even iets in het Nederlands zeggen, straks gaan we in het Engels praten. We zijn hier vanavond om met John Gray te praten over heel veel dingen, maar vooral ook over zijn nieuwste boek, The Soul of the Marionet, de ziel van de marionet. Is het goed vertaald? De vertaling die is net verschenen en het boek trouwens ook, dus het is bijna gelijktijdig. En ik weet niet of John Gray veel introductie behoeft. Hij is, wat mij betreft, een van de belangrijke hedendaagse denkers. Niet alleen over politiek, maar ook over de mens en de wereld, om het zo maar te zeggen. En is vaak controversieel in zijn gedachten. Zijn bekendste boek is Straw Dogs. Dat is eigenlijk een klassieker geworden. En later Zwarte Mist, Black Mass, The Silence of Animals, zijn meest recente boek voor dit. En ik denk dat we gewoon moeten beginnen. We zijn hier vanavond uitgenodigd door Writers Unlimited, het festival wat u allemaal kent in Den Haag. Uitgeverij van John Gray, Ambo Antos en de Centrale Bibliotheek natuurlijk. En er is een mooi intermezzo wat we hebben op ongeveer 2/3 van ons gesprek. Dan komt Shahin Nassiri, een student filosofie, die de, moet ik zeggen, Peter Baer-prijs heeft gewonnen voor zijn essay. En die komt een column uitspreken over aan het eind van de avond, zo rond 1:10, dan zal John Gray nog boeken signeren voor wie zo enthousiast is geworden als ik om het boek aan te schaffen. John Gray, welkom.
Thank you very much, Bas.
This book, The Soul of the Marionette. Could you tell me what triggered it off? What made you to decide to write a short inquiry into human freedom, as the subtitle is?
I think the main trigger was the story with which the book begins, which is the story written by Kleist, the German poet, 19th century German poet, in which he reports a conversation that the narrator of the story had with someone who'd been watching marionettes, puppets, playing on a stage in a town square. And almost the whole story is an account of their exchanges. And the most vivid moment in the exchange for me, which when I first read the story, which might have been 20 or 30 years ago, stayed in my mind ever since, is when the interlocutor, the chief person who's being spoken to, says, the puppets who move on the stage look more graceful and more spontaneous and more free than human beings. He said human beings move in a kind of stuttering, stilted, jumpy way. They're almost always on the edge of stumbling or falling down. But the puppets float in the air. They seem completely graceful and spontaneous, as if they were free from gravity. They're free in a way that human beings can never be. So when I first read that, I asked myself the question, if they're free from gravity, these puppets, what does gravity mean in the context of the story? And I conclude it's pretty obvious, I think. Gravity means the burden of choice. What holds human beings down in this story is the need to decide to choose what to do, whereas the puppets don't need to choose what to do. They do what they must. And as the story comes to a conclusion, the main speaker suggests that true freedom can come in two forms, which might not be actually as different as they seem. One is the freedom of the puppet, which moves without having any will of its own. And the other is the freedom of a God, which has perfect consciousness and perfect knowledge and therefore knows what to do. So that suggests, as it were, a conception of freedom in which freedom isn't, as we nowadays commonly suppose it must be, choice. So the freest person, the freest human being is the human being with the widest or the most valuable choices, range of choices. But freedom for the puppet, according to the interlocutor in this story, is freedom from choice, freedom from the need to choose. Now, I was particularly fascinated by the last few lines of the story in which the Genesis myth, the biblical myth, the myth in the Old Testament, is repeated. And in the way that the story is told in the story, it's told in a kind of heretical way, a way which was actually adopted by many of the practitioners and writers in the tradition of Gnosticism, the ancient religion and philosophy which was widespread in the ancient world and which spread into Christianity, into Judaism, into Islam, into Buddhism, which was a very widespread view, according to which the real hero of that story, the Genesis story, is the serpent. Because the serpent offers Adam and Eve, offers humankind knowledge. And through knowledge, the serpent says, you will have freedom. And through freedom, you will transcend all the natural limitations of human life, including the need to labor and the need to die. You will become immortal. And that idea of freedom, that very radical idea of freedom, I think was strong in the ancient world. And later in the book, I suggest that this idea has gone through many different versions and permutations, and has reappeared in some of the more radical scientific thinkers of our time. Thinkers like Kurzweil, Ray Kurzweil, many of you will have heard of, who is now, he developed the idea of the singularity, an explosive change in human knowledge, but he's also director of engineering at Google, so he has a large organization and huge resources at his disposal. And Kurzweil, along with some other thinkers, has suggested that the result of the new technologies taken together and the singularity, which, by the way, he gives a date for. I think the latest date, he thinks it'll be the year 2042. It used to be.
I still will be there.
Yeah, well, he'll be there because he's on a very rigid diet involving about calorific restriction, the kind of diets that have been experimented upon rats, which lead rats to live longer, and takes enormous numbers of vitamins every day, and has in fact, excuse me, it's like code, published a diet book. It's on. I'm not making this up. Look at Google and look at Amazon when you leave, called Transcend, and it's how to stick to a diet which will make you immortal. And the reason it will make you immortal is the diet won't make you immortal, but if you follow the diet, you'll probably live till 2042. It used to be 2054. I think as he gets older, it'll be pushed back a bit. It might be 2039. But anyway, around about 2042, if you hang on till then on this diet, thin as you'll be, eating almost nothing apart from these pills and having countless medical tests every week, the singularity will then occur, and you can become immortal because your brain, or rather the contents of your brain, your mind essentially, can be uploaded into the virtual realm, uploaded inside, where it will be immortal. And that's, I think, a scientific version, if you like, or a version in scientific language, of the Gnostic idea of freedom, because you won't have a body which ages and grows frail and old and then dies, which can be attacked or tortured or shot at. You won't have a body anymore. You won't have any of the vulnerabilities of the flesh. You won't be trapped in the material universe, because one of the Gnostic beliefs was that the material universe was a dark prison. You've got to get out of the prison into the light, and the light would be that of much, much greater knowledge, or even perfect knowledge, and that's what gives freedom, according to the Gnostics. And the whole book is about that idea, which is the opposite of what I myself think.
But so what you say, because Kurzweil is well known, but is also known for his extreme, almost messianistic kind of view.
Yes.
But your point is that this idea of Gnosticism, that we live in a world that is flawed,
yes,
or even made by someone, bungled.
That's an important point. The Gnostics thought that the creator of the world, the God who rules the world, isn't the real God. The God of the Old Testament, the God which appears in the Genesis myth, isn't the real God. The God that rules the world is malevolent, at best indifferent, probably malevolent, maybe mad, or may be indifferent, or may have forgotten that he made the world, gone on to other things. Later, the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who I admire very much, gave a different version of this, which suggested that God had perhaps developed, he didn't use the term because it wasn't, a form of senile dementia. Had become as we would say, Alzheimer's-like, and completely forgotten that he'd ever created this world or human beings in it, but wandered off and created other botched worlds and forgotten about them too. But that's a kind of Gnostic idea that the God that rules the world, there may be a higher God, they thought so, a purer God, which is kind of somehow vanished or been, but the God that rules the world is ignorant, mad, or malevolent.
Mm. And where does that humans live? Because you said in this tradition of Gnosticism creates the belief that we as humans can overcome this flawed world by our own.
A few of us can anyway, because it's not among the Gnostics in the ancient religion. It's not all human beings who do this. You have to dedicate. It's a few adepts. They dedicate themselves to intense prayer, solitude, silence, fasting, perform spiritual exercises, which in different traditions, Jewish Gnosticism, Christian Gnosticism, Platonistic, Buddhist, Sufi, and other forms of Gnosticism, they form various types of physical and mental exercises which enable some of them to transcend the world. In other words, the idea of what humans really are for Gnostics, including, I think, Kurzweil, is that humans really are sparks of mind or sparks of consciousness in a dark cosmos. We're sparks. And the fact that we are in this body, that we have an animal body, that we emerged from animal kin, if you accept Darwin's theory, which I do, and Kurzweil does as the best approximation to the truth, that's irrelevant. What we really are for these things is sparks of mind. So freedom, practiced by these Gnostic adepts, enables a few of them to escape that. And similarly, I think among the modern Gnostics, it's not commonly suggested that everyone will get the benefit of being uploaded. I mean, it might be expensive, might be quite expensive. You might have to have a kind of Silicon Valley income, or at least a Silicon Valley income before your company goes bust, because a friend of mine who was out in Silicon Valley lately said there are trailer parks there of failed startup people, failed entrepreneurs who've crashed and burned. But if you've still got a kind of Silicon Valley income, you can afford the whole business. You can afford the vitamins, 200 vitamins a week or a day even. It will cost a lot of money. And so some people will be able to afford the technologies which will enable them to become their minds, or a kind of replica of their minds, to become detached from the physical world, to enter the spiritual or the cyber world, and thereby become immortal.
Now, Gnosticism, when it's written about, is mostly by people in a positive way, because it makes them escape from the rigorous kind of belief systems like Christianity, and say, you know, because it places humankind central. Yes. For you, that's the main objection against against Gnosticism, because you can see the inheritance of Gnosticism, as you write it in the book, as a kind of philosophy that's been adopted more or less unconsciously or consciously, is to say that we humans are able to overcome our own limitations. Yes. That's the fundamental belief that is much more widespread than Kurzweil.
Yes, yes. Well, at the start of the book, I quote something from a writer I admire enormously, who wasn't a philosopher, but I think had great philosophical gifts, Borges, the Argentine writer and poet. And in one of his essays, which are kind of partly based on real thinkers, but partly fictions, one of his essays called A Defense of Basilides the False. He wrote, "In the first centuries of our era, the Gnostics disputed with the Christians. They were annihilated, the Gnostics, but we can imagine their possible victory." Now, the argument of my book, which I put it at the end, is that they've won, the Gnostics. Christianity and Judaism and traditional religion have actually lost, but they've won not in the form of an open Gnostics. I think the last genuinely practicing Gnostics in the world, this is a sad story, I'm afraid, but a true one, the Mandaeans. Any of you heard of them? The Mandaeans lived in Iraq, and they survived over the Ottomans, the British, Saddam, survived till the Saddam regime was toppled by the American-led invasion, and after that they'd been massacred. They were a small sect going all the way back to the start of 2,000 years ago, They didn't convert. They only reproduced. They didn't believe in converting other people, so they didn't bother anybody else. They survived until then. The remnant are in places like Melbourne, London. They've been sort of almost destroyed. So that kind of tradition survives only now in the tiniest fragments. But the ideas of Gnosticism entered into modern science, and they entered into it and are expressed in this kind of messianic way in Kurzweil. And the idea that humans, the human species, will be liberated by knowledge, that knowledge is inherently good and liberating, is something that nearly everyone nowadays believes. It goes all the way back in Western philosophy to Socrates. Socrates, if you know the truth, if you know the good, you'll perform the truth. But it's actually not my view, and my view is closer. I'm not a Christian, I don't belong to any religion, I don't practice any religion, but in this respect, I think the Old Testament biblical, the Hebrew myth of Genesis is a much more profound myth if you interpret it in the traditional way. The traditional way is that knowledge, I think there are many different interpretations, hundreds of them, but one of the most traditional ones is that knowledge is actually ambiguous ethically. That knowledge can be used to enslave. Knowledge can enslave those who get the knowledge, and they can use it to enslave others. And this is an idea which is terribly strongly resisted in my lifetime, which isn't yet very long, but I'm getting old. I can remember when photocopiers, I grew up at university before photocopiers, so I had to pull the book down, wrote my notes on a very laborious process. I can tell you photocopiers are progress. I'm a skeptic about progress, but photocopiers did represent a genuine human advance. So did anesthetic dentistry, by the way. There were a few. Flush toilets, that kind of thing. But the one I remember is photocopiers. But they didn't do what people at the time said they would do. This will be the end of tyranny, because we can reproduce books without having to publish them. We can spread all over the world. Later on, the same thing was said about the video camera. Up till and before Tiananmen Square, people said, now that it's possible to really film massacres, there won't be any more massacres. Tiananmen Square. Someone told me, I've never verified this, so I can't say that it's true, though, that the video film of Tiananmen Square was broadcast all across Chinese villages by the authorities to show people what would happen. And similarly, when the internet came along, many people said, this is tremendously emancipating and liberating. It is, in some respects. But in other respects, of course, it isn't, because it's abolished privacy. None of the people, here's a confident prediction for you. I mean, it's easy, predictions are difficult because they concern the future, but I'll make one pretty confidently. No one in this room will live in a world in which there is the privacy that I enjoyed 20 or 30 years ago. Privacy is gone forever. It doesn't matter whether there are legal restrictions on the powers of government, whether the revelations of Snowden and others are acted upon. It doesn't make any difference to my mind, not much difference. Because if our governments don't spy on us, other governments will. If governments don't spy on us, companies will. If companies have stopped spying on us, organized crime will spy on us. If organized crime is somehow stopped, very difficult, terrorists, the technologies are there, and everything we do, even though there can be encryption and there can be various kinds of technical fixes that work for a while, everything we do practically now is leaves an electronic trace. How many things do you do in a day which leave an electronic trace? Practically everything. And that can be stored, and we have no privacy again. So again, as I say in there, it used to be said everyone can enjoy 15 minutes of fame. Well, what I would tell you now is none of you will ever enjoy 15 minutes of privacy, 15 minutes of anonymity. If any of you achieve 15 minutes of anonymity by chance, by accident, you'd be followed for the rest of your life. So that's gone for good. And in fact, back in my book in 2003, I published a book, Al-Qaeda and What It Means to Be Modern. It was about the Al-Qaeda phenomenon, which I said was modern in many ways, as the horrible and barbaric phenomenon of ISIL is modern in some ways. I said that what would happen is that the abolition of privacy would turn out to be the necessary price of preserving individualism. Sounds paradoxical, but that is intended as a kind of paradox, but that the society such as our own, which I think have many important values and virtues, so I think they're worth defending, societies in which there's some freedom, there's some toleration, there's some diversity, there's some peace, there's some decency, there's some Women aren't enslaved or sexually bought and sold in large numbers the way they are by ISIS. Children aren't sexually enslaved. People aren't murdered because of their beliefs in large numbers. Whole communities aren't murdered the way ISIS tried to murder the Yazidi. Whole traces of ancient civilizations aren't destroyed the way the ancient city of Nimrod is being destroyed. At least with all of the vices and weaknesses and faults and flaws of our society. We're better than that, but there won't be privacy as it used to exist in the past. It's become technologically impossible. As I say in the book, we're living in a kind of virtual panopticon. The panopticon being, some of you may know who've done philosophy, was an ideal prison, which is invented by the English philosopher and reformer Jeremy Bentham. But when he invented the prison, he wrote, and I quote him in here, he said, "This is a model not just for prisons, but for every social institution. Schools, orphanages, hospitals, factories, everything. And it would be one in which social control was achieved by permanent universal surveillance." And I think we've sort of come close to that, and it's difficult to get out of it.
So, what, in your view, causes this perennial optimism of humankind about when there's a new technological development, it becomes immediately kind of, well, let's say messianic. It will save humankind or will bring people together. I think when the Suez Canal was made, Walt Whitman wrote this, because of the shortened route to the east, people will be brothers. So this is a kind. What is the cause of this optimism against better knowledge or against experience?
Well, it's been continually falsified. I mean, just in my lifetime, 3 or 4 times, but in over history, start with the telegraph, or even before that, or, as you said, or railway trains. They were all going to have this world-transforming effect, and of course, they did transform the world, but they didn't change human beings very much. There were still wars. There were still genocides, there was still persecution of minorities, there was still all the kind of immemorial evils. Some of them changed their names or appeared in new forms, but they all carried on. So why is it? Well, I guess it's one reason is that we've inherited from Christianity, and Christianity is not now the predominant faith in Europe, but we've inherited a kind of radical optimism that in the pre-Christian world didn't exist. If you study pre-Christian Europe, they thought that history, all the old Roman historians, thought that history was cyclical. If you read philosophers, ancient philosophers such as Marcus Aurelius, who was a really existing person, but he was a Stoic thinker, but he was also emperor of the time, and there were other Stoic philosophers who were slaves, Epictetus. What they all thought was that there were periods of freedom, periods of peace, periods of wealth, periods of knowledge and learning, and if you like, of civilization, and that those periods of civilization were followed by periods of barbarism. So history was cyclical, a rising and falling civilization. Now they also thought, and I've quoted actually a fictional source for one of these, but Marcus Aurelius was a real source, that if you're living in a civilization, however flawed it might be, you have a duty to defend it, and you should have a duty to defend it, even to the death. Because to be a civilized human being is better than being a barbaric human being. You have a duty to defend it, even if you know, as they strongly believed was the case, that civilization will eventually succumb to barbarism, until after some period of barbarism, a new civilization arises. So for them, it was possible to be resolute, to be stern, to be tough, to have a lot of fortitude, defending civilization, even though you knew that this civilization, even if you extended its life for 50 or 100 or 150 or 200 years, would succumb to barbarism later on, because that for them was natural. It was part of the nature of being a human being. Now that idea, which in many different forms, pretty well everybody assumed versions of that, including even the leading Christian thinkers like Augustine, up to about 1750, when it began to be believed in parts of Europe under the influence of the European Enlightenment that the future could be completely different from the past. That civilizations, far from rising and falling, would merge into a single civilization, and that civilization would get stronger and stronger over time. There'd be periods of regression. there'd be problems, there'd be challenges, there'd be terrible phenomena would arise, developments, Nazism and others would arise. But over time, human civilization would become less and less fragile, and barbarism would become less and less of a threat. That's what I think nearly everybody now believes. But no one believed that until about 1740 or 1750, and I don't believe it. My view is closer to the traditional, classical, pre-modern, if you want to call it, but the view of the ancients, of practically everybody in the world, not just in Europe, not just in ancient Greece, but in China and India and Japan and everywhere, actually, that human civilizations rise and fall, that they're worth achieving because life, civilized life, is better than barbaric life. But barbarism is also natural for humans. Barbarism has a certain appeal for humans, has the appeal of the forbidden, of transgression. It has many different sources of appeal. And so barbarism regularly comes back. And it must be resisted, it must be defend what we have of civilized life and so on. But it's very difficult for us to do so with the beliefs of the pre-modern period. Because I've had many people, well, if there's no chance of it lasting, I'm going back to bed. So I normally say, well, go back to bed. You know, have a nice sleep. Wait till you find some reason to get up. But it's very difficult for people to adopt this pre-modern attitude, even though many people actually did. I think it even survived, to some extent, in the Second World War. Lots of people went to war against Nazism. And if you read their diaries and their books, and there were poets who did this too, in England and elsewhere, who didn't believe that after the war there would be a permanently higher civilization. They just thought that this was a terrible evil which had to be resisted and if possible defeated, or even better destroyed, which it was for a while. That was necessary, even though what came 50 or 100 years after that, who knows? Civilization is fragile. And that's the view that I take.
There's a rather provocative chapter. Well, lots of it in your book is quite provocative for some of the believers in progress and secularists. But this is you write about the Aztecs. Did I pronounce it rightly? The Azteca, who seem to have included this element of barbarism into the idea of civilization by the human sacrifices.
Yes.
And you seem to regard it as a rather wholesome example.
I wouldn't go that far. I use the Aztecs not as a model, but as a kind of mirror, kind of distorting mirror. Because the Aztecs did practice human sacrifice, and it was practiced in the whole society. There's a wonderful book, one of the great works of modern social science, in my opinion, by a woman called Inga Clendinnen. It's referred to, The Aztecs and Interpretation. And she reads the ancient script. She knows as much about them as anybody does. And she pictures this way of life, represents it, which is, first of all, until it was destroyed by the Spaniards, pretty well completely destroyed quite quickly. After wars and sieges and so on, but it was destroyed by the Spaniards. It was autonomous. It wasn't imposed on the Aztecs by anybody. It grew up over time. And practically the whole of the society, the women, the children, everyone was involved in this. And it was daily life involved these terrible rituals. Now, what I say in the book is, and this is what I believe, I said, any form of life that depends on human sacrifice is barbaric. So it was barbaric, that's for sure. But then I asked the question, the reason I chose it, apart from the fact that I read this magnificent book and was deeply impressed by it, is that the Aztecs are about as different from us as anybody we can imagine. More different than China, more different than India, more different. They're really, really, really different. They didn't believe in science. They had kind of mythical astronomies, mythical creation stories. But they were very different. Let me just mention that because I think this might make it more vivid. The first thing that the conquistadors remembered, because some of them wrote memoirs or were interviewed, kind of made statements at the time. The first thing that they remembered, the first thing that struck them about the Aztec cities when they arrived, the very first thing was how clean they were. They were immaculately clean. They had roof gardens everywhere. They were swept repeatedly all the time. And they were immaculately orderly. And these were people common soldiers who were used to the filth, the smell, the stench, the chaos of European cities at the time. They said things like, if you read them, we thought it was a dream. No city could be so clean. No city could be so orderly. And yet, of course, all the time, almost continuously throughout the world, there was human sacrifice. So that was the kind of the first thing. Why did they perform the human sacrifices? Well, again, there are many theories about it, but the one that Glendinning adopts seems to me to be quite plausible, which is that they thought they could somehow appease the underlying chaos in the nature of things, which was embodied in the gods. Very interesting is the way they regarded their ruler. They selected a chief who was usually a warrior and male, and that ruler became their what they called their great speaker, which is the ruler of the Aztec communities. Only after a period of silent meditation in which the ruler became somehow one with God. But the God that the ruler became one with was described by them as the mocker. God for them was a mocker. God played terrible jokes on them all the time. God was more of a Gnostic God, if you like. God rolls us around like peas, plays with us, makes fools of us. And he said, and our rulers, they said, are our enemies. But they weren't anarchists. They said, our rulers, he said, we elect our rulers become divine, and then they become our executioners and our enemies. But they never imagined that they could do without these rulers, because what these rulers did was protected them from the meaninglessness which they thought was in the nature of things. And even their art embodied this. In Western art, at least art that comes out of traditions like Plato and Christianity, the truest things in our art are often thought to be the things that are out of time or that last a long time. For the Aztecs, the truest things were things that vanish quickly, passing time. So feathers, they achieved their highest art in feather work, which is inherently. And their poetry, they have quite a lot of poetry, quite a lot of it's been published, been translated and published with, is all about transitoriness. Anyway, that's the way they are. And the reason I kind of used them, there's two reasons. One is they're so different from us. And yet I thought, by being so alien, so different, so completely different from us, if we took them as a mirror, we could learn something about ourselves. Because what they did was, they used death, killing in fact, as a way to confer a meaning on life. And I think that hasn't died out, that kind of practice. In the modern world, among us, we have many kind of movements in which people have killed and shown themselves ready to die on a large scale in order to create a world which was permanently better. I don't only mean the obvious example of the jihadists, though they're the obvious example. As I mentioned in the book and elsewhere in my writings, the suicide jacket that some of the suicide bombers, Islamists now wear, was originally invented in its modern form by the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, which used to be Ceylon, who were Marxist-Leninists. They were ex-Christians and ex-Hindus, didn't believe in a future life, weren't going to enjoy the attentions of 70 virgins. When they died, they were dead. And it was taken up by people in India. I think one of the Gandhi family was assassinated by one of these belts, someone wearing one of these belts. And in Lebanon, in the 80s, a number of other suicide bombers used them. And among the suicide bombers who used these belts there, some were Islamists, I think about 60%, but the remainder were communists, Christians, including Christian women teachers. They were so it wasn't the case that it was a purely. It seems to be quite a widespread human phenomenon of human beings using killing and a willingness to die themselves, sometimes in the same act, by a kind of suicide murder, suicide terrorism, as a way of creating meaning in their lives, except that rather than placating some mocking god like the Aztecs, what people think they're doing is creating a new world in which there'll only ever be peace. So if the Marxist-Leninist world could ever be achieved, there would be no states, no classes, no inequalities, no war, no violence of any importance. That's what they think they're doing. And even those who've supported wars of regime change, I think, are not different from this fundamentally. They think that even though a war of regime change may be terrible, many people may perish in it, there might be appalling cruelties and horrors, out of this will eventually come a world of democratic states in which people say democracies never fight with each other. There'll be no more major wars. So that's why I use the Aztecs, not as a model, but as a kind of mirror, by being so alien from us, by something completely alien in many ways. And yet they were human. They spoke a language we can translate. They had many characters. They had children. They fell in love. They wrote poems. They did various things like that. And they used brushes a lot, maybe more than we do. They were very clean. But they also practiced human sacrifice. I thought that from that, something could be learned. But of course, when I wrote that, by the way, when I wrote that, I told someone, I said, I bet you £100 that someone will say he wants us all to be Aztecs. And it's exactly what has happened.
Now, there are some people, quite influential, who think that an example like the Aztecs is something that we gradually leave behind.
Yes.
We become less barbaric.
Yes.
And people like Steven Pinker wrote a quite influential book about humans getting less violent.
Yes.
And there's a lot of statistics in the book saying not as many people die in wars. It may look, if you read the newspaper, it may look quite terrible, but actually it's not as terrible. Look at the past. Many more people died in wars.
Yes.
There's a chapter which is quite ironic in your book, which is against, of course,
Pinker.
this kind of optimism.
Are people aware of Pinker here? Steven
I think
Pinker?
some of, yeah.
So you will. He's an American, very gifted man, by the way. I very much admired some of his earlier work. Steven Pinker. He's a Harvard linguist, neuroscientist, historian. I mean, he's a very, very brilliant man, I think. I think he's completely wrong about this, but he's a very, very brilliant man. And he wrote a book called The Blank Slate, which I very much admired, and an earlier book about language.
And this book is called The Better Nature.
The Better Angels of Our Nature.
Yeah.
And what he says in this book is just what Bas has just said. He says that over time, especially over the last 100 years or so, a few hundred years, the human species is becoming less violent, wars becoming less violent, wars are becoming less costly in human lives. And the book is over 1,000 pages. It's exhaustively researched, voluminously erudite, got lots of graphs and tables in it, aiming to demonstrate this point. Now, why don't I accept it? Why don't I accept that human beings are becoming less violent? It is partly a matter of evidence, but when I look at the examples he gives, I'll mention just a few things quickly because there's a chapter in the book about this, so I won't try and summarize the whole chapter. But one is he focuses, not entirely, but quite heavily on battlefield casualties. And it's true that in the 20th century, for example, battlefield casualties were going down and have continued to go down. That's to say, people who die on the battlefield. But why is this so, and what has it been accompanied by? Well, I think from the middle of the 20th century onwards, one of the big reasons, which he rejects, he just thinks this is not true, was the balance of terror, the nuclear weapons. From 1950 onwards or thereabouts, it became simply too dangerous for the major powers to engage in full-scale war with each other as they had done earlier in the century, because nuclear weapons, when Russia got the nuclear weapon, that was it. When it spread further, that was it. It became too dangerous. But what then happened then, from the 1950s onwards, were countless proxy wars. Korea, terrible war. Vietnam, absolutely awful. And now, for example, much smaller war, he would say, only 5, 10, 20,000 people perished. Ukraine has become a proxy war between the East and West. Russia's involved, though they deny it, they obviously are, but so is the West. It's a proxy war. And there are countless of these proxy wars kind of broke out. Now, it's true that if you add up all the people who died on battlefields in these wars, there are fewer of them. But something else happened as well at this time, which is, and even happened from the First World War into the Second World War, which is that the number of non-combatants who died as a result of the war went up. In the First War, it was about 10%. In the Second World War, it was about 50%. In the war in the Congo, non-combatants are about 90% or more. And in this, I believe, will also be true if anything like accurate figures, and I actually don't think accurate figures are possible. That's another reason I'm doubtful about this. In Syria, and in Ukraine, let me give you an example which appeals to you. If you turn the television on and watch an account of the war in Ukraine or in Syria, you'll sometimes be shown interviews with people, often old, often women, aged old ladies, living in basements in bombed-out areas of cities. They're living there somehow. They've survived there 3 to 6 months. Now ask yourself the question, will those old ladies be there 2 winters from now? Probably not, if the war continues. Where will they be? They'll be dead. Would they have been dead otherwise? Probably not. Would they enter the statistics? Or take a different example. Supposing you're not an old lady who perishes in that way, but you're someone younger, a woman who's raped as part of the war, because that certainly happened in the Balkans, it certainly happened in Syria, and rape has become a weapon of choice among certain, and in the Middle East. Supposing you survive physically, you enter a refugee camp, you have various health problems in the refugee camp, and you die in your 40s. Will you be in the list of the dead? You've died 20 years later. The point is, there are forms of violence which are lethal in that they shorten and cut off someone's life, but they're not immediately fatal. You don't die in the next 10 minutes or the next 10 hours. You might not die for 10 more years. But you've been compromised, you've been damaged psychologically and physically perhaps, but certainly psychologically by an experience from which it's difficult to recover. Now, my argument is that many of those casualties don't appear in Pinker's statistics, and some of them can't because much of the human cost of knowledge of war is incalculable. We can know that there are these old ladies who will die. They will die. It's a painful thing to think about it. They will die. They're not going to survive 2 or 3 more winters. Not in Ukraine, for example. They will perish. And most of them will perish before their time. Just as it's being said that pregnant women are now dying more commonly in Ukraine because they haven't got the... women in childbirth and pregnant women are dying because they haven't got the proper equipment, and there are constantly disruptions and threats and so on. But it's very difficult. You can have models of the population. You can say, well, for some reason or other, the Ukrainian population seems to have gone down by 1.5% during these years. You don't know who died. You can't actually separate out. So I'm very skeptical of these figures. I think these figures have a kind of spurious concision, which people find very consoling. Because if you want to be consoled and look at the world, and I don't deny, by the way, that the big battlefield figures have been going down. There have been one reason he doesn't mention, though, which one of his critics, one of his expert military critics has pointed out, is that sounds kind of rather gruesome, but battlefield surgery has made huge advances. Most of the people who would have been dead in the Second War, or even the Vietnam War, aren't dead now. Even if they lose all their limbs, they survive because they're taken more quickly to the battlefield surgery. When they get to the battlefield surgery, what's done to them is much more effective and more skillful. So figures have been given by various critics who say that deaths have been reduced by about 70% from battle. So there are all kinds of reasons. Also, we don't have large conscript armies anymore. We don't have these absolutely enormous armies of 2 or 3 million people. There is voluntary conscript. They're much smaller. Our army in Britain now, this may be good or bad, has been reduced by austerity cuts to the level, right about the levels it was in the Napoleonic Wars. It's only going to be about 60,000. One of the huge military powers of the world, which can be almost nothing. So obviously, even if, God forbid, even if many of them would perish, the numbers would be very much smaller, and they probably wouldn't perish even on battlefields because they would be kept alive. So I'm skeptical of the figures, but the function of the figures, I think, is to console people that human conflict isn't simply going on. Human conflict isn't simply, it's kind of fading away, which I don't think it is. It's assuming new forms, different forms.
And it's also a consolation that humankind will be better in the future.
Yes.
So will be able to better itself morally.
Yes.
And you seem to think that's basically impossible.
Human knowledge grows, we know that. I'm not a postmodernist because some postmodernists say science is just another belief system, it's like magic. I don't think that's true. My reason isn't an reason of philosophy. There wouldn't be nearly 7 billion human beings in the world if science didn't work. Why are there 7 billion human beings in the world now? Because of public health, vaccination programs, intensive farming, drains. All these are all spin-offs from the growth of scientific knowledge. So science does work. Human knowledge increases. There are errors in scientific theories, they're corrected, but human life, human events, ethics and politics, or if you like, human civilization, isn't like that. Human civilization isn't a series of problems which are solved and errors which are corrected. What we think of as errors are continually repeated. And why they're continually repeated? Well, I'll give you a couple of reasons. One is that the lessons aren't learned. After the Second World War, most of the people who emerged, I mean political leaders and soldiers and populations and men and women, mothers and fathers and children, not the children but the mothers and fathers, most of those who emerged intact remembered the near collapse of European civilization into Nazism and barbarism. They remembered that. But they were young enough and strong enough, they were still in their 40s or 50s, to build something else. So the period, actually, the Second World War was in Western Europe, at least. Eastern Europe went under the communist tyranny for 40 years. But in Western Europe, it was a period of peace and, I would say, a human advance and of civilization. One of the great periods in human history, maybe coming to an end now, but that was one of the great periods. They'd learned a lesson. They'd learned that one can't really have 20 or 30% of the population unemployed for long without great dangers. We don't seem to have learned that now in the case of Greece or Spain. Or you can't have 70% of young people, 66% in Spain, unemployed, not for 6 weeks or 6 months, but for 6 years or 8 years or 16 years without terrible consequences. And we don't seem to have forgotten that lesson. That lesson, which was learned for a while, has not been learned again. And that's partly the forgetting lesson, but it's also for another phenomenon which a writer, one of my purposes is to direct my readers, not necessarily to accept anything I say, but to books or writers that I think are wonderful and not read enough. But one of them is the American historian, died a while ago, somewhat ago, Barbara Tuchman, Tuchman, Barbara Tuchman. She's never a professional historian, she was an academic, but didn't work in the Department of History. She wrote wonderful books, absolutely one of the First World War, but one of her books is called The March of Folly. March of Folly. And she says many of the greatest disasters of history aren't mistakes, in the sense that the people who took them knew or were told or advised or were warned not to do what they did, but did it anyway. Folly means when maybe what has been an error in the past is embraced and becomes part of the very identity and the meaning of the lives of the people who embrace it. So in Europe at the moment, I actually think that the euro, which originally was, if it had been kept to a few countries, Germany, similar countries, the Netherlands, maybe Belgium, Finland, Austria, etc., could have worked. It was kind of extended out, and as it got extended out, that was a mistake, but that mistake has become embedded in the thinking and the minds of the European projectors of the euro, of the European elites. They'll hang on to it, come what may. So people have said to them, not just me, but many people, 7 years ago, 2007, I said, if this carries on, if the level of deprivation and economic dislocation carries on in countries in Eastern Europe and in the European periphery, the old demons of European politics will come back. The old demons of European politics being hatred of immigrants, hatred of gay people, hatred of Jews. These will all come back. You'll have new, nonsense, terribly pessimistic, horribly cynical, horrible misanthropy. It won't happen. Well, from nothing, almost nothing, a Golden Dawn is now the third biggest party in Greece. I think it's no longer impossible. I'm not predicting this, but it's definitely no longer realistically impossible that Marine Le Pen could win in France. That would be an earthquake of the first magnitude, would it not? And why has that happened? Because over the interval period, the economic situation has either not gotten better or has actually gotten worse for large numbers of people in many countries, and all the mainstream parties, social democratic, liberal, and moderately conservative, have held on to the central strategy. And when it became possible in 2012, maybe Greece could have been given a kind of holiday from the euro for a few years. That was actually proposed and thought about, wasn't done. Too late now. And the worst disaster now, if you want me to kind of look forward to the next disaster, I hope it doesn't happen, but the worst disaster will be if the Syriza government is discredited. If it's forced into accepting a version of the austerity policies, maybe tries to call them something different. Like they call the Troika the institutions now. We're not negotiating with the Troika, we're negotiating. Nobody's taken in by this. Everybody knows it's exactly the same people and the same institutions. But if that happens, if Syriza is discredited, then ask yourself the question, I won't predict, what will that do to support for Golden Dawn? Could go from the third to the second party. And that will happen all over Europe. And that's what Tuchman in this wonderful book called Folly. And that's, it's a deep-seated human tendency to identify with one's mistakes and make them the meaning of one's life. So instead of correcting a mistake, which is what we try and do in science, we test theories and try and falsify them. In life as a whole, in ethics and politics, it's much more common to become addicted to our mistakes, to become identified with our mistakes, and instead of reducing them or eliminating them to double up. Okay, that didn't work. We'll double up. We'll try twice as hard. We tried killing the bankers. It didn't work. We'll have to kill the bank tellers. That might be it. We tried killing, in other words, that won't work. Okay, we'll kill more. And so that's a deep-seated human trait. And so for a variety of reasons, which are really all go back to, so to speak, forms of self-division in human beings, forms of flaws in human psychology, the growth of knowledge doesn't make human beings more rational. They remain as irrational as they were before, but it only makes them more powerful. It doesn't make them more wise and more compassionate. It just makes them more knowledgeable and more powerful. They can do more things with their knowledge.
I see a lot of cheerful faces.
Well, I'll try and come up with something cheerful.
But
I'll do my best.
Is it also what you describe in another chapter about the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick?
Is he a name well known to you? He wrote the story which was turned into Blade Runner.
Yes, we have the
most of you will have seen.
So
most of you will have seen Blade Runner.
And
there's now the final cut, I believe.
Yeah.
Wonderful film, by the way. One of the greatest films ever made, I think.
But you describe him because he was mad for a long time. He's schizophrenic, I think, and so he was very tortured. But you describe him in an interesting way because it says not only something about him, but also something about us, maybe, or maybe not you, but about me. Is that he believed in, though he was very sharp-eyed, though
he was a sharp guy.
Yeah, he's very intelligent, and he had a lot of things with you in common, but he also, beneath, he had this he said we may live in a flawed or rotten world, but the essence is good.
Yes.
So there's something to be discovered, and you described him in this Gnostic tradition.
He described himself that way.
Yeah. So that, we are living in a flawed world, but behind that, if we take away the veil of the bad things...
There are the good things.
There are the good things.
Yeah.
Is that the basic belief of...
It's a basic sort of, I wouldn't call it an error, but it's a sort of, it leads to very bad, very bad results, because in people who believe that, because if you think that there's something standing between us and something that's perfectly good, it's very easy to identify that with some other human being. If you think, what is it? It's the church. It's the Jews. It's capitalism. It's communism. It's something standing between us is perfectly good. Now, in the case of Philip K. Dick, he was an autodidact, but he's a very learned autodidact, and he wrote this enormous kind of manuscript. It was never intended for publication, but it has been published. You can buy it on the internet as a separate book. It's about 1,000 pages, in which he sets out his philosophical journey. Quoting extensively from the Gnostics, citing the Gnostics, saying that he is a Gnostic, and that he's learned an immense amount from them, and describing his own experiences, which the peak of which was a series of experiences he had. I think it was 1974. I think it was. Several months he had what, for the rest of his life, he was unable to decide fully were either a psychotic breakdown, which sometimes he said he'd had. On other occasions, he said it was an illumination from a higher order of things, and then sometimes he said it was a mixture of both. And he struggled for the rest of his life to make sense of these experiences. Now, again, the background of this, if you read, there has been some good biographies of him, you find that there were features in his life which might help to explain this. He took every imaginable kind of drug, including amphetamines, hyped himself up to it. He took all the time he was taking every conceivable type of drug, LSD, the lot. So, one can easily say he addled his brains to some extent. Also, he had a kind of troubled childhood and a troubled early life. He was very troubled by the death of a member of his family. It haunted him for many years. Didn't have a good relationship with his father. And he had a tendency to paranoia, which was exacerbated by the atmosphere and events of the Cold War, the early Cold War in America, the McCarthy period. He was visited once by and this is fact because I think it's been established by fact under freedom of information, he was visited once by FBI agents who tried to persuade him for money and to pay his tuition fees and those of his then girlfriend to spy on some of his other teachers, other students. It did happen. But I don't know this to be true, but I'm pretty sure countless numbers of people were visited in that way. But he became convinced that his every move was being watched for the rest of his life. Very, very, very unlikely. He didn't have any special or sensitive information. There's nothing to get from him. He was just a semi-batty writer. And they're not going to spend all this money sort of... they did intercept his mail for a few weeks. That was established later. But he became very, very paranoid that he was being watched. Usually he thought it was the FBI or the CIA, but at times, because he was obsessive about his tax affairs, he thought it was the Internal Revenue Authority was after him. He thought he'd been broken into. For a while he thought it was CIA, then he thought it might be the Internal Revenue, the worst of all, he sometimes said. Or it might be American fundamentalists, because he's been involved with various radical clerics, including a radical cleric, Bishop Pike, his name was, in the San Francisco area, who'd been involved in parapsychological experiments attempting to contact his, that's to say, Pike's dead son who'd committed suicide. Been involved in all this. And it's true that some of the fundamentalists hated him. But some of Dick's friends said that when Dick was burgled, they thought that it might have actually become, mightn't have been any of them, might have been him who burgled himself to confuse everyone, and then maybe he came to believe it was someone else. So he was a kind of mixed up guy. But I think that a writer of genius, there's a new version of one of his great stories, The Man in the High Castle, which is a story of alternative history. He wrote the story which lies behind Blade Runner. Tremendous genius as a writer. He used science fiction to ask what human beings really are like and what the world in which they live really is like. It was tremendously powerful. But I think his belief, it sounds a kind of optimism, you see. People say, if he believes that behind this veil, behind this darkness, there is perfect light, that sounds wonderful, that sounds absolutely marvelous. It didn't actually work like that with him. The way it worked with him, and not only him, is that he became paranoid, he suspected. He found meaning, paranoia really in general, and I think we all have some tendency, it's a human tendency, everybody has to some extent, is to find meaning where there is none. If you talk to a genuine paranoid, if you've ever met one, if they see the postman pause, it's because he or she is looking at him. It's not the reason they pause. They're tired, it started to rain, they're worn out. There are countless other reasons, or no reason. That's why they've paused. But they see meaning absolutely everywhere. And Dick became like that. He lived in a world with too much meaning. And the danger in human life in general, it didn't happen to Dick. Dick didn't embody this, is that once you start thinking like that, you think that what's kind of holding back the good meaning are bad people. So get rid of those people. And so the belief that everything is underneath is perfectly good need not have in itself good consequences. It can have, and did have in his case, very bad consequence. How he has ended his life, he just had a heart attack. He was dosing himself with countless vitamins and drugs and God knows what and so on. And he just had a heart attack one day and taken to the hospital, and a couple of weeks later he died.
Well, we move to some more optimistic subject later, to the big question that was asked by the organization on the poster: can we change the world? Well, but maybe first we go to our little intermission, or not an intermission, but our commentary of Shaheen. Maybe you will read your. I think the mic will be working. Your take on John Gray's book. As I said, Shaheen has won the Peter Bear Prize. That's quite a lot of money, I think. I'm not
going to talk about that.
But it's not just one of the prizes. It's the prize. It's a big prize for a promising student. Shaheen is originally from Iran, and he wrote a thesis he's working on. He's a student of philosophy at Leiden University, and now I have forgotten the English title. Yeah, it's Rethinking the Notion of Freedom from the Standpoint of the Refugee. That's his thesis, and that's why he won the prize. And now he will read his column about John Gray's The Soul of the Marionette. Shaheen.
Thank you for the introduction. When reading through The Soul of the Marionette, Professor Gray's recent publication, I was on various occasions reminded of the farewell letter of Wubo Ockels, which he wrote just before his death last year.
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't catch that.
Wubo Ockels.
Oh, yes.
He's an astronaut.
Ockels was a well-known physicist and the first Dutch astronaut in space. He was also a professor at the Faculty of Aerospace Engineering in Delft while I was studying there. As a prominent advocate, designer, and developer of green and sustainable energy and technology, He was convinced that it is not our type of technology that has to be changed in order to sustain life on Earth, but our mindset and our attitude towards our planet and ourselves. The first sentence of his letter reflects this firm conviction. It is enough. We have gone too far. The Industrial Revolution has brought us in an unwanted state. We bulldozed through nature. We ruined our life support. We need to stop. We need to change. We need to choose another path. Orwell believes that human beings are, unlike bees and neurons, intelligent and self-aware beings, and capable of leading humanity and the world to a better direction. To that end, our will is the key, and our belief in humanity will give this will. An important question arises here. Can human beings accomplish such a fundamental change by means of their free will? This question characterizes one of the main themes of Professor Gray's recent work. In this context, he investigates the possibility and the sense of human freedom in view of a human-like object called marionette. A marionette is not able to act at will and therefore represents the state of servitude. By contrast, it is believed that human beings have the capacity to choose. They possess free will. In the modern era, this notion of free will has been linked to self-awareness or self-consciousness. The modern man feels that he can determine and control the course of his life and his world. Our free will is that which makes us so special among other species. This idea has been coupled with our mythical obsession with the concept of progress. Nowadays, we continuously talk about economic growth, technological innovation, scientific improvement, production of new electronic devices, and consumption of diverse new products. Gray calls this sacred faith in free will and progress into question. In his view, it is not the freedom of will or self-awareness that is singularly human. Rather, it is our inner conflict and our desire for meaning which characterizes our remarkable nature. This inner conflict leads us to seek satisfaction of our desires and at the same time to label them as evil. It makes us both to be terrified of death and fight for the preservation of an image of ourselves. Human animal kills its own species not only for survival, but also for the sake of dreams and illusory ideals, albeit progress, freedom, God, nation, and so on. There is for Gray only one adequate conception of freedom, which is neither self-realization nor self-awareness. Rather, it is the interpersonal practice of mutual non-interference. It is a rare skill, as he puts it, that is slowly learned and quickly forgot. However, this negative freedom is due to the emergence of hyper-technological surveillance society, the virtual panopticon, more than ever under threat. At present, even the struggle for human rights goes hand in hand with torture, arbitrary mass killings, and aggression. Under these conditions, seeking inner freedom is the only possible type of freedom that can be enjoyed today and in the foreseeable future. By way of this inner freedom, which is itself a negative capability, we will surrender to the confusion of choice and make our way in the stumbling human world. Since humanity is incapable of overcoming its inherent limitations, we should accept the unknowing and our inherent ignorance and let meaning come and go. It is exactly this inner freedom that is alien to the spirit of modern age. Professor Gray's examination of freedom, like many present-day discussion on this topic, revolves around the two prevailing concepts of freedom, that is, positive and negative freedom. In this way, he engages in the modern logic to dismantle its limits. But the predominance of these conceptions does not entail that there are no other ways to approach freedom. For example, isn't it possible to relate freedom to our original creative faculty of positing or presenting oneself with things and relations that are not given? For it is, to my mind, not only our inner conflict and search for meaning which characterizes our humanitas, but also our ability to represent, distinguish, choose, posit, count, speak, fabricate, assemble, adjust, make, and construct. All these activities are incorporated into our linguistic, technical, and artistic abilities. It should be noted that Gray admits that science, religion, and art are creative powers that are essentially human, However, he does not address how our creativity or our radical imagination contributes to the very constitution of our human world and its fundamental institutions, such as time, space, laws, type of human being, means of productions, and so on. Equally, there is in his account of inner freedom, which echoes ancient receptivity and submission, little praise for such a thing as creative force or radical imagination. This creative force cannot be subordinated to willful rationality, intentionality, or consciousness. From this point of view, freedom might be understood as the capacity to participate in both chaotic and cosmic dimensions of our world, and at the same time to accept that foreseeable order and unexpected ontological disorder are intertwined. As such, this capacity enables us to inquire into the adequacy of established laws, norms, principles, institutions, and presuppositions. This self-questioning is both inherent to Professor Gray's creative thinking activity and the careful observations of the Dutch scientist. However, Wubbo Ockels has a more hopeful scenario for us. In his view, it is possible to change the world by relying upon a new humanistic myth, the so-called happy energy religion. This new religion is the expression of our aspiration to change ourselves in order to let life be, that is, to sustain the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to react?
Well, that was a wonderful exposition and criticism of my work. If only my reviewers were so penetrating and so careful in their reading. They can be as radical and as critical as they like, but normally they attribute views to me which I never have had or which I explicitly reject. In fact, I found the more clearly and simply I reject a view, the more likely it'll be that it'll be attributed to me. But that was a beautiful account. What could I say about it? Well, I think it was good to start with the astronaut and with sustainable energy, because it's true that in that respect and in others, I do differ very much from what the astronaut says and from what many people say, many green thinkers say. That's to say, I strongly accept and even assert that global warming, on all the best scientific knowledge available to us, is largely caused by human action. It's what they call anthropogenic. There are other theories of it which suggest that it's connected with sunspots or climate cycles, but the best science I know, and I know some of the scientists who are involved in this work, assure me that, and we've given lots of evidence that the global warming we've achieved is a byproduct of industrialization. So humans have caused it. But from the fact that humans have caused this, it does not follow, in my view, that humans can stop it. For two reasons. One is, once the process is at work in the biosphere, it lasts for hundreds and thousands of years. The second reason is more fundamental. The second reason is the reason I gave earlier on. Contrary to the astronaut, humans are not a collective agency. There is no agency in the world which will do the stopping. That's what Copenhagen showed. Is someone going to tell China to stop building traditional coal stations? Tell India to stop doing this? Or if no one's going to tell them, is this humanistic myth going to sweep the world and produce some kind of consensus on doing this? I'm certain that that won't happen. And why am I certain that that won't happen? Because human beings will be moved principally. It doesn't mean I'm completely pessimistic. There's another way of responding to this problem. Because human beings will be moved, as they always have been moved, principally and chiefly by their most urgent needs. So if you've been very poor your parents have been very poor for a long time, and coal mining or some other form of polluting technology promises and actually does increase your chances of survival and your standard of living and your children's standard of living, you'll go ahead with that, even if the long-term impact on the planet is negative. That's the way humans react. Now, in other words, what then will happen? Well, my view is kind of an unpopular view, if you like, which is that human beings there will not be any global change in consciousness. There never has been. There won't be on this issue, even though the stakes are very high. What will happen is that humans will adapt to the change that they're bringing about. They'll adapt through technology, but they'll also adapt their practices in various ways. They'll adapt their farming. They'll adapt piecemeal in different countries under different regimes in different ways. China's bringing in a lot of sustainable technology side by side with the rather polluting ones it's trying to phase out slowly. America has moved towards shale, at least until the oil price collapsed, because about 40% of the shale industry in America is now underwater, which means, it's losing money. It's going to go bust because it's quite expensive, shale oil. But they've moved to that, which is a risky technology in environmental terms, but not maybe as harmful as coal or tar sands, which are probably even more harmful. Different countries will do different things. France will continue to be heavily nuclearized. Japan, I think it looks like returning to nuclear power despite Fukushima. And we'll adapt. We'll adapt. There may be huge costs. People will say, you mean they'll adapt? But that's appalling. You mean there'll be famines, there'll be ecological refugees? Yes, all of those things will happen. But that's because humans are as they are. There's no world authority, there's no global consciousness, there's no new religion. A religion of happy energy is like the religion of canals that Bas referred to, which developed here. It's like the religion of railways, the religions of artificial intelligence now. These are all kind of ideas which invest meaning in some new technology and think they will solve our question. What I'm afraid of is actually different, actually, from what not maybe different, but what I fear more than what Greens fear, is the use of technologies in very, very bold and ambitious forms of geoengineering. I don't know if you know what geoengineering is. That's the idea which has been put forward by some scientists that we should do something like put an enormous umbrella between the Earth and the Sun. Or fill the skies with clouds, because one of the things that clouds do is reduce global warming to some contrary to what. Let me give you an example. In 9/11, when 9/11 occurred, all of the commercial airlines in America, mostly in America, but in other parts, were down for several days. And for a short time, the global temperature went down and then rose. I think I'm getting it right now. Wait a minute. For a short time, the global temperature went up immediately. And the reason for that is that there's a phenomenon known as global dimming, which occurs from the trails of planes lasting for a while up in the stratosphere. And they prevent sunlight getting through. And they lead, paradoxically, in other words, the pollution of that kind of air travel keeps the world cooler than it used to be, which has led some people to propose forms of geoengineering in which you shroud the whole world with clouds. And then in other words, if the whole world did give up all polluting technologies tomorrow, not going to happen, the paradoxical near-term result would be that global warming would accelerate. But what humans will do, not as a collective entity, not as a collective decision-making, not through the UN, not through any of these, not through some new Copenhagen or anything else, is that different communities, different nation-states, different communities within it, there were different groups, will make adaptations. And those adaptations will probably be, I think they'll preserve elements of civilization. And they may involve things that many Greens don't like. For example, they'll probably involve something more like the intensive urban living in a place like Singapore. In Singapore, life isn't really bearable unless you have air conditioning everywhere. But they do have air conditioning everywhere. And they also have things like vertical farms in kind of like on skyscrapers, rather than spreading them out. They've given some land back, as you have in Holland actually, as well, to wilderness or to the sea. They've given them. So by various adaptations, they're coping with this issue because there's no possibility of that kind of change of I've taken part, I hardly ever do debates anymore, but I've taken part in things. People say, we've got 1,000 days in which to solve this. And I say, well, what happens when we get to day 999? Do you send a telegram to the Earth and say, Give us another 1,000 days? Do you say we're losing our patience with you? You've got to change your ways. You've got to react more slowly. What do you do after 999 days? It's all fantasy.
So no happy energy religion for you, I think.
No. But no unhappy energy religion either, because what we'll do is, humans are very sturdy, resilient animals. We'll adapt.
And we are nearing the end of the conversation before I move to the audience. But one question is, what would be, I think one of the lessons, I think, of your book is that humans should learn to distrust themselves.
A bit more.
That knowledge is not liberating in the way we are adapted to think. So what would be the best attitude of us towards ourselves as humans?
I don't think there's a single good attitude. You see, I mean, one of the key human beings are different. They have some common features. We all know we're going to die, for example. That I think, if you ask what is the primordial difference between humans and other animals, it's other animals, elephants gather round a dead elephant, so they have some kind of conception of it. And dogs can tend the graves. Maybe they think the master or mistress of the dog isn't dead, but there seems to be some kind of dim conception of mortality. But what's distinctive of human beings is we have not a clear conception of what happens after we die. We don't know, actually. I assume that, for me, I act on the basis, not a belief. I might turn out to be wrong, but I act on the belief that it's the end, for me. But we have a kind of clear conception, in the case of ourselves, and even more painfully, actually, I think much more painfully, of those we love, that when they die, they're gone. And so that's a kind of universal feature, or near universal feature of human beings. But human beings are very, very different in other respects. Some human beings try to erect a complex pattern of symbols and beliefs in their lives and in their minds, which they stick to. Others prefer not to think about ultimate questions at all. One of the universal responses to being human is to just go on living your life, fall in love with people, fall out of love with people, make decisions, unmake them, live a normal human life, and don't bother about ultimate questions. I think millions and millions and millions and billions of people have always done that, and that's a different one. And yet others, poets and so on, artists, try to embody their insights into verse or music or statue and in various. There are many, many, many different. So there isn't one. But what I would say is the main difference, if there is a general difference, is don't expect that any time will come in your life, and certainly don't organize your life on the basis that your inner conflicts will disappear or even diminish. And that, by the way, is, I'm a great admirer, not of everything he thought or said, of Freud. And if you read what Freud wrote, which is some of it in a kind of scientific jargon, but some of it is in absolutely beautiful, clear language, he often wrote that what we need to do is not, in other words, he didn't think of psychoanalysis as a way of calming or liberating us from our conflicts. He didn't think of it in that way. He thought of it as a way of learning to live with the conflicts which don't go away, because they're part of us as human beings. So I'm suspicious of anyone who offers a way out of human conflict. Because when it comes to societies without conflicts are societies without troublesome minorities. Societies without conflict are societies without disruptive thinkers. The kind of society Rousseau imagined, I know Rousseau was a more complicated character than we often think, but the society that Rousseau imagined would be one in which everyone, as it were, knows what the good is, they cleave to the good, they get merged in the good, they accept the good. So actually that kind of society, anybody who deviates from it, anybody who's unusual, anybody who has a different conception of the good or some kind of radically new idea, will be penalized. That goes all the way back to Plato. Remember, Plato wanted to ban poets. You never know what poets might come up with. So I'm also suspicious, and that's perhaps more telling nowadays, because many people admire and want inner harmony. I know some psychoanalysts, I know some psychotherapists, and what about what people come and ask you for? They ask me to come and sort of to find some way of solving their problems. Now, of course, what they might want is to be less anxious, and there are various techniques, cognitive behavior therapy, or various kind of, and they're useful. Even maybe drugs may be useful at times. But the idea that psychotherapy or psychoanalysis or some other type of similar practice could cure us of our inner conflicts means to cure us of being human. Because our inner conflicts, we love people, we sometimes even hate the people we love. We love them so much, but we're afraid of the fact that we love them because if they die, the bereavement is unbearable. The loss is unbearable. We hate people, we despise some other people, and yet, even in terrible cases of warfare, when terrible cruelties are being inflicted, we draw back. George Orwell, a writer I admire very much, fought in the Spanish Civil War. He was actually wounded, he got a bullet in his throat. But he records, and I believe him, by the way, that he was in the middle of a kind of battle, and he had his sights kind of fixed on a fascist fighter. You know, just about to pull the trigger when the man's trousers fell down, so I didn't pull it. In the middle of a war, and although I'm considered to be very kind of deeply pessimistic, deeply kind of, I think those kind of things happen all the time. They're part of, but also cruel things can happen pretty well all the time as well. They're part of what it means to be human, those conflicts. So the main way in which I think we, if we can, or if we want to, because again, I'm not prescribing it, I'm not saying you should do this. So many people practice meditation to feel more peaceful. If that's what you want, if that's what you go ahead. But I think as a general idea, one which I would suggest you think about is that it's a mistake to try and eliminate our inner conflicts. We can't eliminate them really without ceasing to be human or ceasing to be alive. What we should try and learn to do is to live with them better than we do. That's to say, not deny them, because actually when we do deny them, you know, if we deny, so to speak, evil elements of ourselves, the commonest way we deny those evil elements in ourselves is to project them on other people and then attack those other people. It's a very kind of common way. If we knew that, in a sense, we're all like that, I don't mean we're all ISIS, we're all as bad as that, but if we knew that within us all these impulses are tied up with each other, or they're what would make us human, and distinguish us from the other animals. You know, I've never seen cats transfixed with remorse. I just shouldn't have eaten that fish. It was so greedy. I left no fish for my litter mates. Terrible. I've never noticed that among cats. Dogs, maybe, because they seem to be able to absorb some elements of. They don't have a self-image of themselves. Most animals, in which they're trying to, as it were, have a self-image in which is only or predominantly good. So they don't have a self-image of themselves which they identify with and then radically compare with themselves in practice and condemn themselves in practice. Just a kind of final point, because it's a true story. Many, many years ago, a long time ago, and the person concerned, the philosopher concerned, isn't around anymore, but a well-known then philosopher told me that he'd persuaded his cat to become a vegan. Now, I've kept cats for some 30 years. I've had lots of cats. I would even say I know quite a bit about cats. And I was slightly skeptical, let's put it like that. So I said, did you have good arguments? He said, oh, very good arguments. He said, powerful arguments? Yes, very powerful. I thought he was joking. Alas, he wasn't. So I said, did you come up with special types of food, maybe mouse-shaped pieces of soya, or gradually wean the cat onto a vegetarian diet and then get to the higher levels of feline veganism? And what it seemed to be is he gradually shifted the cat over to vegetarian kind of dry food. And the cat sort of accepted that. But then I said, well, but did the cat go out? Capital O. Did the cat go out? He said, oh, yes, it did go out. Well, you can probably sort of think, well, what do cats do when they go out? Well, they either hunt or they find another family from which they get non-vegan food. But either way, they get non-vegan food because they're programmed to seek meat. That is their kind of life. Now, I don't regard that as a sort of a failing in cats. I don't regard all cats as sort of failed cats or cats suffering from feline original sin. That really what they want to do is to be vegans, but they're continually pushed down by their anti-vegan natures. Cats are what they are. Humans are different. Humans are self-divided. They pursue their desires but hate them. They're afraid of death but seek it out. They dread being killed but put themselves in positions where they will be killed. They fear the loss of meaning more than they fear the loss of life. So that's the way we're unique. We are unique in that sense, at least on this planet. That's the difference between us and other. And if we love other animals, as a writer, which I hugely admire, perhaps more than any other writer, though I haven't written about him much, mentioned him now and then, Montaigne, Michel de Montaigne, is the writer who, more than anyone else, I think, has embodied in his writings what it would mean to live, in a sense, on a basis not of belief, but of doubt, or just not of anti-belief or unbelief, like the evangelical atheist, but just of a kind of suspension of belief. And he was very fond of other animals for exactly the reasons I said. In fact, he even said, when I play with my cat, I'm never sure whether it's actually me playing with the cat or the cat playing with me. And he was deeply, and he led in it was a dangerous time, could have been killed for, or imprisoned or killed or even tortured for heresy and so on, but he wasn't. He lived wisely and kind of shrewdly. He loved people. He had close human friends and people he loved, but he also loved animals. But he was able to live like that without without the kind of the gravity of belief in his case holding him down. He was able to live simply in unknowing and doubt, and that, if you like, I find that quite inspiring. But I don't think that necessarily anyone will be converted to it. If there was any even practical kind of advice I would give you all, it would simply be not even to buy a copy of my book, though I hope you do, but to buy a copy of Montaigne's essays. Open it anywhere. Open it the essay on cannibals. Open it the essay on dying. Open it the essay on humor, on jokes. Open it absolutely anywhere. You'll get something which is very, very nourishing and profound and life-affirming.
Thank you. Some brief questions, because it's almost 10 o'clock. There's a mic in the... Yeah, you have a...
There's a mic, yeah.
Yeah, so...
Otherwise we might not hear.
Yeah, but there's another one. So I think there's a question over there. Tineke?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear.
Thank you very much, John. I have a question for you. It may not be directly related to your book, but I think it's generally in the area. This morning's Guardian, I read that David Cameron wants to have a British values test, or wants to introduce a British values test. What are British values? Are they universal? Are they European values? And given that we nearly had a near-death experience 6 months ago of Britain, I would like to know what you think British values are.
It's a nice question. Shall I answer that one straight away? I'll try and answer it straight away. I should mention it by a piece of true narrative. About 10 years ago or 15, 12 years ago, I was asked to go on an EU committee about European values. I refused. I declined. Because what are these values? Would it include the bad values? You know, if I was asked what are European values in general, I would say racism is one. It's very deeply rooted in European civilization. Where did Nazism come from? Tibet? Mars? It came from elements of German Protestantism, elements of medieval Catholic anti-Semitism, elements, also now forgotten, by the way, or denied, elements of what was then called scientific racism, which had been developed in Britain by people like Sir William Galton, and in Germany by thinkers like Ernst Haeckel, who was called the German Darwin. In other words, it wasn't just old medieval prejudices, it included new, nonsensical, worthless scientific theories, but they were supposed to be science. So I refused. And I don't like this, this search for European or British values either. I mean, it's particularly kind of silly in a way in the British case, because unlike a number of other countries, unlike France or unlike America, Britain wasn't, so to speak, established in some founding revolutionary movement with a constitution based on certain principles. If you were an American, you said, what are American values? There are huge controversies about what American values were. After all, the Civil War was fought over what American values. I mean, I know there are revisionist accounts of why it was fought, but one of the reasons it was fought was on whether American values included tolerance of slavery or not. So, but you had something they could appeal back to. Declaration of Independence, the American Constitution. In the British case, you have a constitution which is sort of developed partly by chance and by various political developments over time in response to different challenges and wars and other. I mean, even if we came up with, supposing Scotland, you say there might be another near-death event for the British state. I think that's not impossible. I think it's less likely than it was then. But even though the Scottish Nationalist Party, this is Lilliputian, tiny British politics, the politics of the world of Lilliput, but as Jonathan Swift would call it. But it looks to me as if the Scottish Nationalists are going to almost sweep the board in Scotland. They're going to wipe out most of Labour, and they're going to be the single largest presence in after May, after the general election in May, in the of the minority parties in the British Parliament, and the two major parties, neither of them will gain enough to be able to rule by themselves, or even possibly with one other party. The one possibility is that Labour will rule with the Scottish Nationalists. Now, the paradox of that, among the many paradoxes, and my friends who are Scottish Nationalists will hate me for saying this.
They're not here.
But they're not here. There aren't many Scottish nationalists in Holland at the moment, is that Scottish nationalism is now a kind of an absurdist political project, even if it earlier might not have been. Why is it kind of absurdist? For two reasons. One is the oil price. If Scotland had gone independent when it did, it would now be bankrupt. It would be a fiscally failed state. The second reason is the European crisis. The Europeans have said, Brussels has said that Scotland wouldn't be allowed to join the euro immediately, it wouldn't, because it would have to create its own central bank and its own currency beforehand. It couldn't carry on using. So that's insoluble too. So actually, I don't think Scottish independence is a possibility. It won't happen, actually. But what could happen would be a kind of tilt of power, some kind of radical devolution, and an immense period of political uncertainty. Not only could that, probably would happen. But if it did happen, would British values not include Scotland? Would Scotland have a separate set of values? Would they be debating against Scotland? Would there be a bill passing on Scottish values? And if there was one on Scottish values, and if, as some people think, the Shetlands then, some people have argued, I think it's completely fantastic that if there had been Scottish independence, the Shetlands would have declared independence of Scotland, because they have various rights and fisheries and oil issues of their own and so on, and a different language. Some of them speak, parts of Scotland still speak different kinds of English or even Gaelic. Would they hive off, and would there then be Shetland values? Would there be discussions? My view is this, that there are some universal values. I've argued this in a number of my, there are some universal human values, that's to say good things that are good for all human beings and bad for all human beings, but that there isn't a universal morality that the way people think of, because different moralities and different civilizations and different, there are some civilizations which can drift into complete barbarism or near complete barbarism because they're founded on a systematic rejection of many universal human values. But putting those aside for the moment, there are many, many different examples of forms of life in which conflicts between universal values are resolved in different ways. I'm in general opposed to any attempt to come up with something like British values, because for the reasons I've given, but for another reason, which is that it just means enthroning, it just means enshrining the cliches of the moment. But what we now think of as fundamentally important values, if you'd asked someone in 1900 what British values were, you would have found none who said that it included, British values included respect and freedom for gay people. Nobody. Maybe Oscar Wilde, but look what happened to him. You'd have found absolutely nobody. Yet Cameron, I'll give him his due for one thing. I don't like him as a politician at all, but the one thing he's done is brought in gay marriage, which I support it as a civilizing measure. That's good. It's probably the only thing he'll be remembered for. But if there'd been British values in 1900 or 1930 or 1950, or maybe even 1980, that wouldn't have been included. at that time. So in that sense, there's been an improvement in ethics, in my view. So you might say, am I now defeating my own view that there's no improvement? No, because unfortunately what I see in the world is that this advance in ethics, as I call it, by the way, it's an advance which in the ancient world didn't need to be made, because in the ancient world of ancient Greece and Rome, there wasn't persecution of gay people. There wasn't actually a separate idea of, love between men and so on. It was considered as, it was only with the rise of Christianity as the dominant religion of the West that this came about. So actually there was a 2,000-year regression. Now we're going ahead of it. But in many parts of the world, in Russia, in post-Saddam Iraq, in post-Saddam Syria, parts of Africa, even in Britain, there are attempts to change the law back in Northern Ireland, actually, in certain respects. This advance, which I regard as a genuine and real advance, is under threat again. So, but I wouldn't want to sort of freeze everything now, because that would shut off other changes in future. It would just be a snapshot. Who would be asked? I probably wouldn't be, and even if I was, I'd probably turn it down, as I did with the European Commission. Who would be asked what these values are? You get a snapshot of fashionable people, and maybe one or two heretics, just to add a bit of spice. And I think it's a very negative proposal.
There's another question here in the front. No, wait for the mic. Everybody can hear you.
Yeah. I had a question. In your introduction, you spoke about freedom. And when I think about freedom, I think about happiness. And it might seem like a very simple question, but I was wondering, what does happiness mean to you?
One of the reasons I don't write about happiness very much is I think I'm very suspicious of people who write about happiness a lot. I'm very opposed to those who want to replace economic tests of development by happiness tests. I mean, economic tests are bad enough, because as we know, if we just count gross domestic product or gross national product, includes things like if you have more road accidents, there's a pickup in the funeral industry or something of that kind. I'm strongly opposed. I think that's a mistake. I think it's as much of a mistake, or even almost a worse mistake, to try and think that you can tot up all the things that make people happy and measure them against the things that make them unhappy and say we've got more happiness. I mean, after all, it was that kind of philosophy that one of the great dystopian novels of the 20th century, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, it wasn't directed against communism, it was directed against utilitarianism, not against Marx, but Jeremy Bentham. It's the idea that you could add up, in some Bentham kind of moral arithmetic, you could add up all the kind of units of happiness and put them against units of unhappiness or displeasure, and measure progress. And I think that's a dreadful idea. By the way, in the 20th century, an interesting man, some of you might, do you know who Robert McNamara was? Many of you. Robert McNamara was the American Secretary of State who was involved heavily in the Southeast Asian War, including the war in Vietnam. And he's an interesting man. He lived until his late 80s, and his inner life, his own happiness, was completely ruined by his participation in that war. He had endless years of therapy. He had endless years of struggling with what he had believed he'd done, and in fact had done, which include things like the use of napalm, Agent Orange, which 40 years later is producing 60-year-old disabled children, wiping out of whole villages and of jungles and so on. He lived in a kind of psychic torment for most of the rest of his life. And I don't know whether he ever found any kind of peace. He gave some interviews towards the end of his life about it. But one of the things that he thought had contributed to these disasters was a simple calculus he thought we had. You know, this would be terrible, terrible to the napalm people, of course. Terrible thing to do. But out of this, if hundreds of thousands more, tens of millions or more lead happy lives, they have democracy, they have capitalism, they have all these good things, they have freedoms, they have rights, that'll be much better. So that kind of calculus. Now, on the other hand, you see, I don't think that we can ever completely avoid a utilitarian calculus, or not a utilitarian calculus, because there isn't a calculus, I think it's all fictitious, but we can't entirely avoid better and worse, and the person I learned the most from in Oxford, Isaiah Berlin, had a true story. I'll tell it just briefly because I know time's running out, but it was a true story. In the Second World War, a government minister turned up in his office one day where there were roughly about 20 people working and said, I'm going to do a terribly wrong thing now to all of you. All but one of you. I'm going to fire you all, the whole lot of you. You're all going to be fired. And that meant not only being fired, but they would never get another job of any importance, even after the war. Their lives were permanently damaged and wronged. And for all of you, except one. It's a terrible injustice, but I'm going to do it. And the reason I'm going to do it is that we know for sure that one of you is leaking information to the enemy, and that as a result of leaking information to the enemy, brave men and women are being parachuted in, they're being caught, they're being tortured to death, they're dying terrible lives, dying terrible deaths, and the war's being compromised. So I'm going to do something which is wrong. By the way, the difference between this and utilitarianism is if you were a pure utilitarian, you would say it wasn't wrong. You'd say you add up 20 people have had their lives ruined, 19 people were completely innocent, go out to the world, they have worse lives, miserable lives, can't get any secure job because they've got a security black mark over them for the rest of their lives, because we've never found out who did it. And the reason we can't find out, we haven't got time, we haven't, take too long, the war was being fought desperately at that point, but I'm going to do it. If you're a pure utilitarian, there'd be nothing wrong with that, just as there'd be nothing wrong with Sophie's Choice. Remember the movie, Sophie's Choice? But Sophie felt there was something wrong, even though she felt she'd done the right thing. And furthermore, she was forced to do it, to make the choice by the context in which she was put by the Nazis. And so I don't think there are some things that ought never to be done, and so that we should never, sometimes we just have to compare. But what we mustn't do, I think, is we should confine those circumstances to when we're confronting an imminent, urgent evil and danger in which we have no other alternative but to take choices like that. We shouldn't engage in wars speculatively or hypothetically because the situation might be better later. Because the people who survive these wars or revolutions might live in a better world. We shouldn't plunge a whole generation or large part into terrible, unbearable, hideous pain and destruction and agony because in some hypothetical, which by the way, oddly enough, never comes about. Because what happened in post-communist Vietnam is you had a period of, when the North won, you had a period of bloodletting. It wasn't as much as was expected, but I think it was pretty bad. People went to prison. And then eventually what they got out of it all was, surprise, surprise, capitalism. Now, it's a thriving capitalist economy. The people in the interval, what did they get out of it? This terrible experiment? So I think that kind of utilitarian calculation may not be completely avoidable in all circumstances, but we should never assume, we should never think that it can be turned into anything scientific, that we should never assume that happiness is the goal. So that's one of the reasons why I tend not to write about happiness. Happiness can become a kind of dangerous political ideal, and also it's so different for all of us. What governments should do is eliminate the most common and the most universal obstacles to happiness for most people. Very few people thrive in chronic poverty. Hardly any, actually. In fact, I would even go so far as to say none. Very few people thrive in treatable illness. Very few people come out enhanced from torture. Very few people are better people because they've had their loved ones snatched from them and taken away and vanish and disappear somewhere and never return. So what government should really be about is reducing, at least, those universal evils or universal obstacles to human happiness, and then leave people to be as happy or as unhappy as they then can be.
Well, I'm sure this answer made you very happy.
Or at least not unhappy.
I think we're a bit over time, so maybe if there's one last urgent question, very brief, we can do it. Yes, I see one finger.
Brief means simple.
Very simple question, which has an answer, yes or no. Which
well, no, it will be kind of an open, or well, I don't know if it's going to be an open question, but it's more about like your view is you're like proposing some kind of agnosticism, but I see a lot of things that are coincidentally with a Christian worldview. So you're talking about an inner conflict of desires. Like we know that we have some desires that we don't like, and I will call them, because I'm a born-again Christian, I will call them sinful desires. But and you say it's a human tendency. Well, but the Christian worldview explains that we inherited this sin from like Adam and Eve, and we get the fall in sin, and like the answer to that, which can free us from this inner conflict, is like the person of Jesus Christ. But the person of Jesus Christ, well, he rose from the death, and we will rise with him from the death, and we will be freed from our bodies that contains the sin.
Okay.
So I would say
Well, what's the question?
Yeah.
well, I would say the answer is
No, you're just giving me an answer, not a question.
no. I would say no. I'm not.
What question does your answer answer?
Like in my view, the answer would be like the person of Jesus Christ. You need to believe in him, and that
But I still don't know what the question is.
and
you
that
see.
will solve the problem. So
Well, which problem? You see, I mean, in other words, I mean, I'm entirely open. I'll try-
question right now.
Well, what is the question?
Yeah, but
So-
you must make it a little bit briefer. because-
Briefer and simple.
Yeah,
and make
so-
it a question.
So, yeah, why don't you believe in Jesus? Why don't you put faith in him as a person, as an example? Because Jesus said you need to love thy neighbor as thyself.
Okay, we've got
okay,
it. Well,
that's
in one
great.
sense, it's a refreshing question because I'm much more used to people saying, why don't you believe in the single currency? You know, there are more believers in the single currency around now than there are in the virgin birth. Or why don't you believe in humanity? It's terrible. You don't believe in humanity. That's absolutely appalling. Well, I guess one, I'm not a Christian, I don't belong in any religion, but I'm very open to religious solutions, as it were, to the different problems that different human beings have, as long as they don't coercively prescribe those religions for other people. And that would also apply to secular creeds as well. Now, I'm not saying that you do, but if I was sort of really honest about it, I would have to say I'm actually quite mistrustful of all religions of conversion.
I'm just talking about a person, not about
Aversion.
Jesus as a moral example, maybe.
Yes, but you see, I mean, at least since Christianity, which I actually think wasn't Jesus' teaching, Christianity emerged from St. Paul and from Augustine, it's been a religion of conversion. And I mean, if you would say what one of the, it's not possible to unravel this, by the way, it's not possible to roll this back, but if you say one of the big mistakes in human history or follies is religions of conversion. I prefer religions that don't convert others. And the same goes to philosophies. My opposition to philosophies of conversion, including, by the way, and I've written about this recently in The Guardian on last Tuesday, evangelical atheism, to convert the entirety of humankind to some kind of unbelief. I oppose all of those things. I would much prefer, I know this is impossible, but I would much prefer a world in which no one attempted to convert anyone to anything. Maybe some things, because what you get out of that are ultimately terrible things like the attempted genocide of the Yazidi, because the Yazidi don't attempt, just like the Mandians, they don't try to convert anyone else. You get the attempted continual attacks on Jews, which is not, Judaism is not a religion of conversion. I prefer non-conversion religions, but there are conversion religions in the world, and even conversion philosophies, some of them relatively benign. Epicureanism, you know, was a religion of conversion. They tried to convert the world. Mind you, when they were converted, what they were converted was to living in a garden. The idea was that they would retreat from the world and live in their gardens and live very simply, bread and cheese and water, that was it. Listen to the tinkling live very simply, not in luxury. And when death came, they accepted it. When death came, they didn't try and prevent it. I think
That sounds rather horrible to me.
Do you think so?
To live in a garden, yeah.
To live in a garden,
Yeah.
to live in a garden, eating cheese.
Yeah, and listening to waterfall.
Well, that's an example. You see, what is
Yes.
kind of peaceful and placid and tranquil and happy for some people, to others would be a kind of prescription for a nightmare.
Yes.
So that's one of the reasons why I don't like religions of conversion, even when they're rather mild, like Epicureanism was, and why also I'm rather hostile to the propagation of happiness. Not because I like unhappiness, but because unhappiness means so many different things to different people. And even, I would say, to the same person at different times in their life, and most paradoxical of all, to the same person at the same time. That's to say that all of us want to be happy in ways which are actually contradictory and uncombinable.
Before I say thank you to John Gray, I'd like to convert you to reading his last book.
Well,
you can get it over there and have his signature in it.
You can read it and then throw it away if you don't like it.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Shaheen. Thank you very much. There you are. Thank you. Thank you, John Gray.
Thank you, Bas.